You're all very welcome indeed. My name is Trevor Jones. I'm chairman of the Posbury St Francis Trust, and the Trust is very honoured and privileged to sponsor this lecture in partnership with the Exeter Centre for Ethics and Practical Theology. So a very warm welcome, first of all, to you all. Just a word about the Posbury St Francis Trust. It was formed following the closure of the Franciscan community of sisters at Posbury, which is near Crediton. And we sold the properties there, which included buildings and fields, and have invested about £1.3 million in order to provide grants for individuals and for communities in the area of our objects, which are mission, evangelism, and spirituality. And when we have the lectures, we look to the themes that were important to the community. And Sister Teresa, who founded the community, which went to Posbury in 1942, actually had a very important theme, which chimed very well with Francis and Franciscan spirituality, which was what she called ecology. So here we are this evening, and we look forward very much to Bethany and the lecture. Just to say, the Trust also has two properties, one at Posbury, which is called the Tractor Shed, which I have to say is far more exotic and more comfortable than it actually sounds. But we also have the Haven at Porthcurno in Cornwall, adjacent to the Minack Theatre, overlooking the wonderful beach at Porthcurno. And that's available for people to go for rest, for recreation, for study. And if you want any more details, please look on our website. Just Google the Posbury St Francis Trust. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Susan Cornwall, who's going to introduce our speaker and I think chair the proceedings. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It will be my pleasure to formally introduce Bethany to you in a minute. A few people over drinks said, what is Posbury St Francis and what is Accept? So you've heard the first bit, and let me do a brief bit of the second bit. So the Exeter Centre for Ethics and Practical Theology first started back in 2009, I think, with a grant from the St Luke's Foundation. And in those days, it was called the Centre for the Study of the Learning Church. And it's been through a couple of changes of name since then. And we've ended up here where we are. But that really reflects the fact that lots of what we are doing within Accept is reflecting some of those relationships and interactions between what is going on in churches and communities of practice, as well as in the academy. Those of you that were here last year will remember some lovely pictures that I put up about some of our previous events. So let's run through those again. Over the last few years, we've been doing lots of work, in particular, thinking about race and decolonisation in theological education, and work around anti-racism. This was a workshop on theological education in Britain and its intersections with race a couple of years back. We've also been doing some work with international scholars in areas like creating global classrooms. So this was a visiting scholar who came over from South Africa to work with us a couple of years back. Gosh, this is pre-pandemic. This is a long time ago. I've lost all sense of perspective of time since then. And then a bit more recently, actually, some of you will remember back to last year when we had our very first inaugural Posbury St Francis lecture, Dr. Chris Shanahan from the University of Coventry. So if you were here then, it doesn't feel like a year ago, does it? But here we all are again. Most recently, we've been doing some work around trauma theology. This was an event that we held earlier. Here's the handsome Professor Christopher Southgate, present in the room with us this evening, among other people, which we did jointly with the Centre for Biblical Studies, another of our research centres here at Exeter. And just this week, we've had Dr. Al McFadyen with us from the University of Leeds, who is both an academic theologian and a serving officer in West Yorkshire Police, and again has been talking a lot about his work in policing and so on. However you heard about this lecture, please keep watching that space because you hopefully will hear about further Accept events we've got coming up. including about a month from now, we're having a visit from Professor Brandon Crowley from Harvard Divinity School, who is coming over to talk to us about queering Black churches and his experience in Baptist congregations in the US in particular. However, without further ado, I should have put your picture up here, Bethany, as well, but people will be able to look at your real face in a moment. So we're really delighted to welcome as our second Posbury St Francis lecturer, Dr. Bethany Sollereder. She is currently lecturer in science and religion at the University of Edinburgh. Previously, she was a postdoctoral fellow in science and religion at the University of Oxford, at the Laudato Si Research Institute at Campion Hall, as well as the Ian Ramsay Centre for Science and Religion. Before that, she received her PhD here at the University of Exeter, and also holds an MCS in Interdisciplinary Studies from Regent College in Vancouver, Canada. She specialises in theology concerning evolution and the problem of suffering, and her first book, entitled God, Evolution and Animal Suffering, Theodicy Without a Fall, based on her Exeter PhD, was published by Routledge in 2018. Her current work is about the theological possibilities and human vocation in the light of irreversible changes in ecological degradation. She's also interested in the intersection between psychology and faith, particularly how different approaches to theology can affect people's experience of suffering. This interest led to the publication of what I think is quite a unique book. This is a theological choose-your-own-adventure book entitled Why Is There Suffering? Pick Your Own Theological Expedition, published in 2021. The first pick your own ending theology book. Bethany is working on a wider research programme at the moment in what she has called compassionate theodicy. She's also recently co-edited a volume called Progress in Theology, Does the Queen of the Sciences Advance? And that's forthcoming with Routledge next year. So I'm delighted, so delighted to welcome you to Exeter and back to Exeter. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Bethany Sollereder. If we maximize,
we just go back to,
if you know what you're doing.
yeah, let me.
You do it.
Thank you. Perfect. Hello, and thank you so much. It actually is really special to be here. You saw a little preview there of the next picture, but and it not only because it is always wonderful to be here in Exeter, but this is actually a very special day because it's exactly 10 years to the day since the day I turned in my PhD here at the University of Exeter. So I want to thank Morwenna Ludlow, the Posbury St. Francis Charitable Trust Committee, and the Accept for inviting me to this lecture. Where can hope be found when what we hoped for is lost? That's actually the central question of this lecture. And there are many places in our lives where this could be an apt question, in relationships that are broken. Yep. Oh, right. Yes, we didn't do that. That's fair. Not a problem. Yes, and welcome to all the people who are online. As we're hearing those little bings in the background, that's people joining online, which is excellent. So a huge welcome to all of you. Why don't you just do the windows and then choose. Yeah, there we go. Oh, perfect. Thank you. All right, there we go. Welcome to those who are online. So where can hope be found? And now we are, here we go. The joys of technology and hybrid lectures. So there are many places in our lives where this could be an apt question, whether it's in broken relationships or situations where illness or accident steals a promising future, or where poor fortune or poor decisions set us on a track we couldn't have imagined. Today, though, I want to explore a lost hope that all of us face, which will continue to bear increasing weight on our decisions and our lifestyle, and that is, of course, climate change. Since the 1980s, climate scientists have warned whomever would listen that the amount of carbon dioxide being poured into the atmosphere by fossil fuel use was in danger of changing that atmosphere, laying a warming blanket of the greenhouse gas around our globe. Now, while some environmental action really was taken swiftly, primarily around the Montreal Protocol established in 1987 to limit depletion of the ozone layer, limiting and finding alternatives to fossil fuels proved too difficult for both national and international political will. Cheap power and the advantages that cheap power brings in terms of health, comfort, trade, food, stability, longevity, and, well, luxury proved too good to give up. Was it really irrational to keep using that cheap power? But 44 years later, here we are facing the warmest year since records began, 1.3 degrees Celsius above the last century's average, and leaving behind the climate that has been the norm over the last 11,000 years since the end of the last ice age. Now, of course, climate change, the warming of global temperatures due to CO2, is only one of a number of environmental changes that we are facing. Freshwater nitrogen loading, ocean acidification, loss of biodiversity, and land system changes are just some of the other ways our planetary home is shifting due to human impact. Now, as you will doubtless know, these changes will have and are already having a profound effect on human well-being. I won't actually enumerate the effects here in terms of food instability, water shortages, migration pressure. You already know these things. I know that I'm talking to an informed audience. So what I want to spend our time doing is investigating where is our hope for the future. Many people are working very hard to try and halt the climate change we are seeing. Millions are working together in technology, in finance, in policy, and in ecology to try and halt, slow, or even reverse this temperature trend that has been revealed in the last 50 years. And one of those people that I've benefited a great deal from is the work of Professor Tim Lenton, a climate scientist here in Exeter, whose work has looked at tipping points in climate systems, showing how once a certain tipping point is reached in, for example, the loss of ice sheets, there's a self-reinforcing cycle that can take hold in these systems. So basically, melted ice reveals warmth absorbing ground below, and then that warmth absorbing ground increases the temperature, which melts more ice and so on, right? So you get this sort of self-repeating cycle that reinforces itself. But Professor Lenton has now moved on to working on positive social tipping points. Once you get some social trends moving, they can gain their own momentum, and change becomes not only easy, but inevitable. So you could think of, for example, 20 years ago, few, if any, people had electric vehicles. Today, all the cool people drive one, right? By 2035, I had a lovely ride today in one by Professor Southgate. So in 2035, new petrol or diesel vehicles will be banned across the UK. So what was difficult once will become inevitable as the social change happens. So replicated across different aspects of society, Professor Lenton hopes social change can happen fast enough to offset the sort of geological changes he studied and described so effectively. Lenton says it's vital to shift away from a sense of climate doom because that's disempowering and leaves us, I think, possibly paralyzed by fear, but also by the complexity of the situation. At the same time, he emphasizes that when it comes to the changes needed to stop or reverse climate change, it is, quote, absolutely clear we're going nowhere near fast enough at doing that. We need to go at least 5 times faster in decarbonizing the economy, end quote. And that is often the place where the public discussion stands. Unthinkable doom on one side, or a Herculean task of immense complexity on the other, with a dose of sort of gritted teeth optimism that despite the evident slow pace of change, it will somehow still be enough to avoid the catastrophe. So this evening, I want to invite you straight into the fire. What happens if the rate of social change is not fast enough to prevent climate change? Do we really face a doomscape of unimaginable proportion? If climate change is inevitable, do our hopes of stopping it are lost? What remains? Well, I took the title for this lecture, Radical Hope, from Jonathan Lear's excellent book of the same name. And in it, he explores what hope and courage looked like for the mid-19th century Crow tribe in North America as burgeoning numbers of European settlers filled their territories and took over these lands that the Crow people once used. When new laws were made, the traditional forms of courage for these people, things like raiding other tribes or the entire life of the warrior, of the male Crow, became illegal. And when the senseless slaughter of the buffalo meant traditional food sources and the basis of their material culture was disappearing, the tribe had to create a whole new way of being in the world. They had to reform their identity around the new reality, or else simply die out. One of the key observations that Lear makes in this powerful and difficult work is that the new forms of emerging courage and the emerging forms of other virtues in the community that helped them survive were often deeply at odds with the previous forms virtue took in the community. So if fighting to the death was a sign of courage in the old paradigm, in the new paradigm, working out compromise through diplomacy became vital, which would have been seen as cowardice in the old paradigm. But now that's the expression of hope and courage for the future. So Lear writes, the very traits that make for a courageous person under the old form of life would place such a person in an especially disadvantaged position to make a courageous transition out of traditional forms of courage. But the new circumstances meant that the old assumptions had to be discarded. A new environment meant a new framework of the basic understanding of the good. So I think we're in a similar moment now. The framework around what we are aiming for environmentally, around what a good life looks like, how we engage politically, are all encountering a new set of challenges where we need a new set of ways to evaluate our actions. We need to use Jesus's language, new wineskins for the new wine of our moment. Any attempt to put new wine into old wineskins will simply lead to disaster and waste. So what does that look like? Well, let's begin with our ideas of what environmental protection looks like. Since the earliest forms of ecology emerged from the Romantic thinkers of the 19th century through early scientists like Aldo Leopold and into the full-blown sort of environmental movement of the 1980s, there's been an emphasis placed on conservation. What we want to preserve is what was present in the past. Human action on natural landscapes, whether through agricultural work, species introduction, industrial extraction, or development, was seen as something that compromised the integrity of the natural state. It moved an ecological system from this sort of historical norm into a hybrid ecosystem. And so the work of environmental conservation or ecological restoration was to try and follow that arrow, to restore it to what it had been, that historical state. So then you go out, you pull up invasive species, you hunt introduced animals like rats or weasels, you replant more native species, and so on. We do everything we can to get back to that perfect state, right? The original way it was. But of course, it doesn't take much thought to see the problem with that. Which historical landmark should we be aiming for? Devon of the 1920s is vastly different to Devon of the 1820s, which was vastly different from Devon of the 1420s. Species that are not native to Britain include snowdrops, daffodils, many of the types of oak that one sees dotting the landscape. There's actually only 2 species considered native. Mulberries, 4 of the 6 species of deer, including fallow and muntjac, as well as rabbits and brown hares, are all introduced species. Take those away, and the British countryside would be unrecognizably bare. But then many of these species were introduced by the Normans or even the Romans. So does 2,000 years here make you a native species? Or do we only give that sort of status to the very first species that migrated here after the glaciers receded some 12,000 years ago, before which there was ice? So one of the key questions in ecological restoration is, what do we restore to? Who decides what is native? And in light of climate change, the question becomes even more difficult because the environmental moment means that as things change, the ecosystem may no longer support the species that flourished here over the last 10,000 years. By keeping out all so-called invasive species, we may actually be left with nothing at all. In response, a number of top restoration ecologists, people like Eric Higgs and Katie Suding, have argued that we should instead be pursuing novel ecologies instead of historical ones. So instead of trying to restore a lost ideal, which will likely not be able to flourish in drier, warmer worlds, they argue that we should lend a helping hand to the changes that are coming to ensure the flourishing of ecosystems and prevent ecological collapse. So that might mean intentionally introducing species that are similar to native species, but maybe are more drought resistant or more heat resistant. And these migrant species can fill the ecological niches that will inevitably be left empty when native species can no longer live in a changed climate. And they will then provide food and shelter required by other species in the ecosystem. Traditional conservation has concentrated on species composition. Can we keep the same species living in an area? Ecological restoration in an era of climate change needs to look rather at ecological function. Can we keep the whole system working, even if we replace some of the parts? Now, I can see in some of your faces, I can hear the protest that is building in your mind. You're saying rabbits and cane toads in Australia, gorse in the Pacific Northwest. When humans mess with ecosystems, bad things happen, right? Yeah, I'm getting some nods now. And I agree. Humans have caused a great deal of havoc by introducing new species into environments. But I think there's one big difference here. In those cases, the new species were meant as enhancements, as things that would allow new human activities like the agriculture of sugarcane to flourish in places where sugarcane itself was not native. So it was sort of like a cyborg where we're trying to get more than natural results from an ecosystem. Captain Picard just has to make an entrance. We were trying to get the ecosystem to do something it didn't normally do. And thus the introduction of species was a sort of eco-enhancement of what was there. But in the case we currently face with climate change, what we're talking about is far more like an organ transplant. We're trying to save the life of a faltering or failing ecosystem. So a species introduction is absolutely a drastic step, just as an organ transplant is. There is a great deal of danger and uncertainty, and things almost certainly will go wrong at places. But the aim is not to make the ecosystem a super ecosystem for some human aim like agriculture, but to simply maintain the life of a whole community of species that rely on each other like organs in the body. The risks of not doing anything are often higher than the risks of bringing in a replacement species. So pressing into novel ecologies is to recognize that the historic landscapes are irrevocably changing, sometimes irrevocably dying. But as Roger Deakin has said, any real hope must be rooted in reality. If we root our hope in the fantasy that we can maintain the Holocene climate, we're only fooling ourselves. First, because as you've seen from earlier on, we've already left that climate. But ultimately, it's also because we don't actually live on a planet with a stable temperature. So this graph shows the temperature on Earth during the whole time that complex life has been on Earth, 540 million years since the Cambrian explosion. The red line, which I've added to this, shows the current average temperature of the world. The dotted line running midway through, so you'll be able to see that here, this line actually shows the point above which there's no global ice. So all the time that the temperature is in the top half of the graph, you have no polar ice caps, no glaciers. The time spent below that, all these bits, and where we are right here, is where you have permanent ice on the planet. On the right-hand side, you can see a little star marked PAW. That's post-anthropogenic warming, that shows where scientists think our current warming trends will stop if we don't change anything about what we are doing in terms of fossil fuel use. Now, what really surprised me the first time I saw this was that 70% of the time that complex life has been on Earth, the graph is above, well above, the no ice line. The entire time dinosaurs flourished on the Earth, the temperature was well above the worst possible scenario of our own instance of global warming. Similarly, if we look at our recent past, the last 425,000 years, so this is now 500,000, we see that we're actually in an unusually warm period. So you can see this is our current thing. That's that last 12,000 years that we sort of think of as normal. This 4 degrees below that is the average over the last 500,000 years. So our just for reference here, those two arrows show you where human evolution steps have been taken. So the first one is where anatomically modern humans came into being about 200,000 years ago. And this is about 50,000 years ago, where you have behaviorally modern humans, where we're starting to do cave paintings and the beginnings of tool use and that sort of thing. So humans have actually been through climate change before, really dramatic 4 degrees Celsius change. Now, this is a point in the lecture where people silently start wondering if I'm actually being sponsored by oil and gas companies or if I hate the environment and am a climate denier. No and no. Do I believe everything is all right and we should just do nothing? Also, no. But if we're honest, if we're facing real reality as it exists in our Earth, we have to acknowledge that we're not going to stop or avert this change. And acting like we can stop climate change when it actually is a force beyond our reckoning is no longer helpful. And putting forward only the worst aspects of the changes that are coming give people no hope in a situation that, by and large, they have not caused, do not want, nor can control. So let's take a look at a typical climate change image.
Sorry, Bethany, before you leave that graph, can
Yeah.
I ask what happened 135,000 years ago to cause that sudden huge, and then to turn it round again?
Oh, yeah. So you see here, so the question was for those online, what happened in these spikes? So you'll see that they're actually pretty regular spikes, and that's actually just because of the precession of the Earth. The Earth, as it goes in its orbit, wobbles, and every once in a while, that causes a spike in temperature, or what they would call an interglacial period, where the glaciers recede. And so we're actually in one of those. And so it actually being stable for so long is really unusual. And quite a few people have thought that the reason it stayed stable for that long and not gone right back down is because of human activity in burning forests and that kind of thing for agriculture. So it's actually likely that we've been unintentionally causing the climate to be more stable than it naturally would be. But in either case, it's going to start plummeting. It would have started plummeting in the next 1,200, 2,000 years. It inevitably it would go down as the precession of the Earth changes again to the some more natural sitting point down here. So, okay, this isn't in the lecture, so I'm going to go long now. But one of the things I often ask audiences is if we were in the place where natural climate change was happening, would we think it's the human task to stop it? Would we think that it's actually our job to try and fuel up the things to keep it on this sort of knife-edge climate? Or should we let it go down? In which case it would have been the northern and southern countries that were moving towards the tropics as climate refugees. The fact that we're not in that position is as much an accident as the one that we're in. Okay. Diversion over. Okay, we have a question at the back. I don't know what to do at this point. What should we? We'll leave them to the end. So thank you. So we will get there, I promise. So if we look at a typical climate change image, it usually looks something like this. We have the beautiful world we have now, or a future world of just dry dust on the left. But when the world really was that hot and far hotter as we saw it, how do we depict it? Usually like this. Can you see the difference? Climate change does mean dramatic and damaging change, but it does not mean everything will get worse everywhere. Some forecasts, for example, model Australia becoming far wetter, making the whole interior of the continent livable, as we know it was in the past. The Arabian Peninsula, known for its lifeless and inaccessible deserts, is now turning green again, with vast swaths of the desert covered with vegetation. The inhospitable Canadian tundra, from which I hail, is now growing more and more plants due to the increased moisture and warmth. And these parts of the story of climate change aren't often told. And I'm not trying to make light of the changes that are happening. They're important, urgent, serious, and will cause suffering for billions. And the rate of climate change is very fast, quite a bit faster than I showed you in even those historical spikes. But if the buffalo are gone, there's some hope in saying cows are coming. Change does not only mean the end of life, but also the beginning of new types of life. And life is not so fragile as it's often made out to be. So if change is inevitable, then we can lay down the burden of hoping for the impossible, lay down the burden of trying to do the impossible. And stopping all climate change always has been impossible, at least to humans of our power and stature. Due to the failure of human institutions, it is likely that totally stopping this instance of climate change is now impossible as well. But admitting that also opens up possibilities. We can lay down the past in the past and look forward to what we can do, to what is within our power. And this is where I would like to go for the last part of the lecture, to the radical hopes that grow in the ashes of our ecological hopes. Lear writes, in order to survive, and perhaps to flourish again, the crow had to be willing to give up almost everything they understand about the good life. And this was not a choice that could be reasoned about in the pre-existing terms of the good life. So what does the future look like? I've already suggested that it looks like pressing into novel ecosystems instead of trying to hold on to historical ecosystems. And I want to suggest 3 more opportunities for radical hope. And in this particular lecture, I am letting myself be inspired by Mother Teresa, the founder of the Franciscan Servants of Jesus and Mary. Now, I've not been able to read much about her, but I can tell you that what I've read, I have loved. Her, as she describes it, wild and completely pagan adolescence, Her conversion under, quote, again, an entirely unemotional compulsion to confess her sins to a friar. I like that. And most of all, her absolutely central passion for social justice. As she put it, quote, all my interest and compassion was with those who rebelled against and broke the law, end quote. She worked with marginalized communities like women with alcoholic addictions, prisoners, and the sick. And her insistence that her community order should not be shut away in a convent, but be actively living in community with the world required a group of, and I know it sounds like an oxymoron, but a group of nonconformist nuns who ignored social mores and religious etiquette and got on with the task of serving God. So 3 forms of radical hope that cannot be reasoned with in the old forms of hope. And the first form I want to find is actually in poverty, not romanticized poverty, not in illness or death, but the type of poverty that Mother Teresa embraced, giving sacrificially to those who have less. And the fact is that just like climate change, poverty is coming for all of us. We have built economies that are built on everlasting growth, but the foundations of those economies are shaking as we've squeezed out every bit of productivity out of people and gas and oil for hundreds of years. The interconnected state of global economics is built on extremely fine margins that even small disasters can cause huge pileups. Do you remember when that ship got stuck in the Suez Canal? One ship stuck for 6 days, stranded $9.6 billion worth of trade. Global finance is built on ever more precariously on impossible debts that rely on that ever increasing speed and efficiency of production. Yet our global trade is quite fragile, and it is likely that continued climate change will be not a ship, but a bulldozer driving right through it. Our trade relies on our infrastructure, on roads, power lines, rails, and so on. And because the Earth climate has been so predictable during those last few millennia, we've built our infrastructure to really only be suitable for the most normal of local conditions. So, as I found out to my shock when I moved here to Exeter from Canada in 2011, 2 inches of snow. It's all it takes. And England grinds to a halt, right? I mean, it could be only -1 degrees and nothing is going anywhere. Now, I'm from Edmonton. Shout out to my parents, who I think are watching on the live stream. It can snow from mid-September until early May. And the average temperature over the central months of winter is -20 degrees Celsius. Cold day hits -40. So to have everything grind to a halt at -1 and 2 inches of snow seemed incredible. But of course, as I came to live here, it now seems perfectly normal and sensible. I'm the one who no longer drives in 2 inches of snow, and I rehearse all the normal things, right? I don't have the tires. There are not the gritters and sanders in the road. In short, we don't have the infrastructure to maintain operations when weather exceeds its normal conditions. And the same is true all over the world. Places specialize for their own local norms, whether heat or cold or somewhere in the middle. And while life can adapt quite quickly, actually, to climate change, our infrastructure cannot. So its vulnerability to climate change will cause, and indeed has already caused, more inefficiencies, more breakdowns, all while our linear economic systems based around GDP growth require more and more and more growth to keep operating normally. And this would not be sustainable even if climate change wasn't a complicating factor. Eventually, once you've captured the work of every man, woman, child, and machine, you just don't have any more you can produce. Well, the demand for the next quarter keeps growing and growing and growing. The monastic vows of poverty that Mother Teresa and other community members made step outside this hamster wheel of desperate production. Their goal was not to hoard wealth or increase productivity, but to care for the poor and provide a place of retreat. And it's as close to a living example of what Kate Raworth has proposed in her Donut Economics as anything else I've seen. Raworth suggests a new vision for economics, where instead of trying to climb that exponentially climbing growth curve, she suggests we think about our economy sitting between two limits. The upper limit showing the sort of ecological ceiling of what our natural systems can take, and the inner limit of that social foundation where everybody has enough energy, water, food, health, social equity that they need. So when we hit those upper boundaries, we stop, but we know where we need to grow, where that social foundation needs to keep on including everyone. So the focus is on keeping within that green circular band, the economic donut. Now, Raworth is not suggesting a few policy tweaks to the economy. She's suggesting a whole new way of thinking about it, abandoning the current standards of economic health, changing or getting rid of a lot of the existing trade and wealth generation processes, and redirecting market energy to a whole new ideology. She is, and she admitted this on a radio interview I listened to, she is asking us to be poorer by abandoning growth, but to live a better life in better conditions because of it. Now, my usual critiques of these kinds of economic models is that, these are too utopian for us poor humans. They just ignore our nature, right? Humans are impossible to please. You sort of think the average Westerner lives with luxuries that would have been absolutely unknown to royalty 200 years ago. Hot running water. Do you realize what a luxury that is? Comfortable, vanishingly fast transportation around the world, central heating, varied foods from all over the world available at a bargain price by any historical standard. And yet, as soon as we have it, we get used to it. We're ready to move on to the next upgrade. So yes, I have running water in my shower at the push of a button, but I don't have a rainfall shower. And my life would just be so much better if the water fell straight down instead of at a slight angle, right? Yes, I flew like an angel across the entire world in a fraction of a day in a wondrous tube of flying metal, making a journey that used to take months only take hours. But I had to wait in a line for 45 minutes at the end of it. It was a wretched experience. So I would normally advocate something more like Bill Gates' approach of green premiums that use market levers to make the new greener technologies cheaper and the more traditional fossil fuel-based technologies more expensive. In that case, you don't have to appeal to people's higher nature. You just have to appeal to their business acuity and greed. But Mother Teresa and all those who actively choose poverty show us that a life on the other side of our capital industrialist complex is well worth living. Indeed, we borrow from their daily life for our retreats. We borrow from their peace, born of the thing that we will not choose for ourselves. And those who choose poverty, rather than have poverty thrust upon them, are important forerunners of radical hope in a world that will, one way or another, become more poor. A second area where Mother Teresa and the other Franciscan servants of Jesus and Mary offer us radical hope is in their pattern of community living. This is especially important in light of patterns of migration. So one of the things that Mother Teresa was known for was the unorthodox way that her community refused to live behind closed doors in a convent, but insisted on being in the midst of struggle and poverty. So she said she wished to live without fear, without setting up the defenses against other people with which religious communities safeguard the lives of their members. For the last few generations, the ideal housing situation in the Western world has been something like this. Every person, or every couple at least, is meant to have their own flat or house. Past a certain point in your early 20s, it's considered a shame if you still live with your parents. Similarly, once your children leave, you're meant to stay in the house your family grew up in, even if it far exceeds what you need. And if you're single, whether through always being single, through divorce, or through death, then you're meant to live entirely on your own, in your own place. Is it any wonder that loneliness statistics are through the roof? Ironically, many of us, and I include myself in this, are simply too rich to be wise. We live on our own or just with our partner because that is the sign of success, not because it's what's best for us or our communities. In the face of this, Mother Teresa's approach to live without fear, some great pictures from the community, but also to commit to living in non-marital community is an important counter-narrative, an imaginative expansion of what our culture finds allowable. And the beauty of community living has been picked up by others into the so-called new monastic movement, a term coined by Jonathan Wilson's 1998 book, Living Faithfully in a Fragmented World. This is community living that is not necessarily celibate or stable in the traditional way, but which includes both single and married people, adults and children. It's not vowed to poverty, but it is to simplicity. And they are committed to the fearless living that takes down those walls of protection and engages in the service that Mother Teresa advocated for. So these commitments are normally articulated as sort of 12 marks of the new monasticism. You can read them there. I'll just give you a moment. Yeah, you can take a picture if you want. Some people are doing that. So these communities do not require lifelong vows, but they allow people who cannot or would not join a traditional order to participate in the rule of life of a community. New monastics do not always live in a single dwelling. They often live in committed close proximity to others in the community in a variety of configurations. And what's interesting to me is that this is another example of people saying, we won't take all we could. We will live in what our culture thinks is worse arrangements because we have a hope that is beyond our culture's horizon. So in 2023, 30% of all households in the UK had only a single person living in them, with the majority of that being people over 65. But new monastic movements hold together people across generations. They hold together single and married, and they don't only create households for the lonely, but create a different norm for people who are forced to live with others by poverty to reinterpret their situation, not as a failure, but as a positive good. Coming back to climate change and Mother Teresa's vision to live without defenses, we really have to mention migration. We often talk about climate change causing increased migration as something that will happen in the far future, rather than something that has already more than doubled in the last decade. According to UN statistics, 3.3 to 3.6 billion people, over a third of the global population, live in areas that are highly vulnerable to climate change. And people's places of living have just become impossible to live in. And they face a choice, either die in place, as in fact many do, or move. So have Western nations, and I mean this Western in the figurative way that includes Australia, New Zealand, and places that aren't necessarily Western, have they responded by saying the emissions our countries have produced are largely responsible for the loss of livability in your land? Please come share in our still livable land with us. I advance that they have not done that. Instead, we've worked to limit immigration, to build stronger defenses, to keep people away from the dangers of the immigrants. Look again at this quotation. What would the UK look like if we were committed to a vision like this as a nation state? Migration as a global phenomenon due to climate change is not going to go away. It's going to increase more and more in the coming decades. How we respond to it will make all the difference. With hospitality to the stranger, with community living, with welcome, or with fears, walls, and always eventually guns. The choice is ours. but the commitment to fearless community living is an essential part of choosing the former world rather than the latter. The last act of radical hope I want to explore is prayer. Now, that may seem an odd one, given that Mother Teresa once said that when she was considering her calling, the local priest said of her, anyone less suited to a life of prayer than myself, he had never met. But she did live a life of prayer. And I think this is often an overlooked response in our time. The other three seeds of radical hope I've highlighted, moving from conservation to novel ecologies, embracing the simplicity of poverty, and living in communities that extend beyond marriage and bloodlines, those are options available to all people, regardless of creed or belonging. But prayer is a mark of religious communities in particular, and it's in turning to prayer that my own Christian convictions are probably most evident. For Christians, prayer not only sits at the heart of personal changes that I've advocated for, that willingness to embrace an uncertain future, the hospitality to the stranger, the ability to be content in a world that always wants more, but it can also be a powerful engine of social change. So when it comes to prayer meetings around climate change, how many have attended a sort of climate night in a church? Have people gone to things like that? Okay, we've got a few. Well, I've been to quite a few, and I've noticed a relatively well-worn pattern at eco-theology gatherings. So it begins with an affirmation of God as creator, usually with the texts like Genesis 1, Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. And then we show some pictures like this, beautiful. Then we lament the damage done to the world, mostly with the help of Romans 8:22, that the whole creation has been groaning, and pictures like these. Then our lament in prayer finished, we appeal to God, to hope in God's recreative work, a recommitment to try harder in our own lives to care for creation, and then we go home. And there's not anything wrong with this. I'm not saying we shouldn't do this. I'm just saying it doesn't actually go far enough. It continues to treat creation care like it's an individual rather than a systemic problem. And it doesn't do enough to work at changing those systemic realities. It simply often recommits to personal work and leaves the systemic change to God. So, what is the alternative? Well, I've recently been very inspired by the work of Josephine Butler and by a new book out about her called When Courage Calls. And Butler used prayer as the engine of political change. When she set up meetings to pray about the unjust treatment of women in her day, they didn't pray in general terms or leave it at lament. They prayed for specific laws and parliamentary bills, and they prayed for specific members of parliament as they went. So there was a political engagement in and through the prayer. And then when they went home from the prayer meeting, they started writing letters to the people that they had just corporately prayed for. So this systemic political change was hand in hand with the work of prayer. Prayer did not, as we often do, sort of appeal to simply invoking divine help as the mechanism of change. The prayer was a transformative part of the political and systemic change that worked with God to change the reality of British life. We can do likewise. So I began this evening with Jonathan Lear's idea that radical hope is built around leaving behind virtues that were suited to the past and embracing a new set of virtues that are suited to the new reality we face. And I've suggested 4 things we can embrace as locations of radical hope in light of climate change. Scientifically, to change our ideas of ecological restoration from conservation of native species to protecting ecosystem function. Socially, to embrace the simplicity of poverty, to leave behind the ideals of sort of independence and solitary habitation that build up walls of defense around us and embrace community living. And finally, to tie prayer more deeply into the systemic change we want to see. Thank you very much for your time and your attention.
Hello. Thank you so much, Bethany. That was absolutely brilliant. And beautifully timed as well, which means we've got lots of time for questions and discussion. We've got lots of people here in the room. We've got lots of people online as well. I'm going to suggest that people in the room, we take 1 to 2 minutes to sort of ponder what you've heard, perhaps turn and say hello to the person next to you who you may or may not know. Talk to them about what you've heard. I know we've got at least one question in the room, which we will come to. Meanwhile, people online, if you have questions, please feel free to either type them into the chat box or indicate that you've got a question. And in a minute, we'll try and take some questions from online interspersed with questions from the room. So talk to the person next to you, make a new friend.
You want to leave that in?
I can't leave chat.
No,
I
we
can.
can do
We put it on here. Yeah,
Yeah.
good idea. I think Moana is going to try and will the slides be available? Are you happy for the slides to be available?
I don't want to copyright out all the pictures.
It's fine. We'll say no. That's fine.
I can certainly send in the ones that are textable. Thank you.
Is this a revival of Schumacher's smallest beauty?
If I'd read that, I could say yes.
Feel free to find it. I think I did once when I was doing my master's in the year.
We should if we're having.
Yes. Mike, does that agree? Why don't you kind of give me another we know about the I was going to say,
Yeah. My pen.
Right. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to interrupt your interesting conversations. I can see some questions online already, so we will. Well, actually, should we start with one of the ones from online? So Anthony asks, is this a revival of Schumacher's Small is Beautiful?
I wish I could answer that, but I haven't actually read Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, but I would like to say yes.
Thank you very much. Have we got a question in the room? Please wave at me and Morwenna will pass you the roving mic. If there is. I mean, there certainly was a question in the room because there was a hand further back, wasn't there? I don't know whose it was because it was behind me.
Yeah, it was,
Question.
there was just so much that I'm just trying to get my head. So my questions sort of changed a bit. I mean,
That's fine. That's good.
I wanted
Do
to make,
grab the mic so people online can hear.
yeah, the comment I just wanted to make on the graph, and this it may not be right, but I looked up the current parts per million for CO2 today, and I think it's much higher than what the graph was showing. I think that went up to about 280, 300. It's now actually
400.
Yeah,
Around
so
400.
it's
Yeah.
it's a lot higher. I mean, I came tonight because I was hoping to see how, embracing theology and a real understanding of texts and stories could be used to try to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. And I was really heartened by how the talk started, and it was clear to me there that, that the Holocene is where we've developed our civilization. And we have no idea if human civilization can exist outside of the temperature, the temperate conditions we've had. A lot of people are saying we can't. But then it was interesting to see how the talk moved towards kind of an acceptance of what's happening, and then looking. But I just wonder if those things about community building, and all those, a lot of the positive words regarding Mother Teresa's outlook that I don't know a lot about, but it was clear that she was a rebel. Community building, rebelliousness, could they be used now to try to facilitate the change we need? Because otherwise, yeah, we're going. It's heading down a really
Yeah.
tough track.
That's really great. So there's two kinds of change that humans do. Some of it is the planning ahead, the facilitating the change we want to see. And then there's the reactive change where change happens and we scramble. Humans are much better at the second. Just the way our psychology works, we underestimate the chances of bad things happen. We overestimate the chances of things we want happening. So if we're going to do the facilitation bit, then we almost have to overemphasize the bad things happening so that our brains take them seriously. And when we're talking about something like climate change, which is big and distant and slow by human measures, that's even harder to do. And so that's why I said, like, it wasn't irrational that people kept using oil once they knew this was a possibility, because its immediate effects for the good life people wanted and could live were so immediate and so good. We have this longevity that is unknown in human existence, largely because of the way that we've been able to use oil to facilitate technology and medicine and trade. So I think, we're in this point where civilization of some sort will carry on because humans make civilizations, but will it be radically different from what we have? Absolutely. But, so I think no matter what happens, we're going to have a bunch of that sort of reactive change where things happen and we are scrambling. So I'm just trying to put a plea in for, well, let's do a bit more of the facilitating change, where and when we can, and also to change our mindsets so that when that change is forced upon us, we're not only seeing the negative of it. So I was introduced as somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about the psychology of suffering. And one of the things that I found in the psychological literature is that the defenses for a traumatic event happening to you are built up not in the traumatic event, but in preparation for it. You've got to do the psychological work before if you're not going to be bowled over by the traumatic event. And that's why I'm pushing for the acceptance bit. Because if we just think, no, this won't happen to us, this won't happen to us, this won't happen to us, then the effect is actually much, much worse. But if we can say, okay, we're going to be poorer, let's actually press into that. Let's see the good. Let's embrace the things, the change in water quality, the change in air quality that could come from being poorer, but not having fossil fuels. There's a real opportunity there that can work with our psychology to make those changes less traumatic, less damaging than they might otherwise be.
I'm really intrigued by the just as I was listening to you there about the notion of the we and the kind of necessary sliding between different types of we. So I work in a hospital setting. I support people who are dying. People say they're terrified of dying. They don't want to die. Well, sadly, everybody will die. And sometimes the question is about orientation. It's whether you're going to die in 10 minutes or 10 weeks or 10 months is the relevant factor. Whether you're going to die or not is inevitable. And I heard a lot of that in your earlier bit. Is the planet going to crumple? Yes. Is all life going to end? Yes. Of course it is. Give a couple of billion years, we're there. Mm-hmm. So you were kind of zooming out and then kind of zooming back in again to help us think about it in different ways. I guess what I was hearing slightly in the question from up the back there is about that sense of our obligation, human to human across the globe. And that sense of when we talk about climate emergency, some of that is actually governed by that interhuman obligation. It's actually not about the planet. It's about how many billions will suffer if we, however we is defined, don't get our act together. Often it's seen as a planetary commitment, but actually it's just a enlarged interhuman commitment. I don't know if you've got any reflection on that.
Yeah, no, that's really great. So yes, I do have a sliding we. and it's difficult to say both who that we is and how far our obligations do extend. So do I have a direct obligation to somebody on the other side of the globe who is in one of these places? The answer is kind of both yes and no. No, in the sense of these conditions that we're in the middle of were, again, not of my choosing, not of something I want, not something I could change if I could. But at the same time, can I make a difference for a person on the other side by saying, let's change our migration policies in this nation. Let me do that work and be involved in that political change. And then let me open up my house to accept climate refugees to come live with me. Yes, I can. So I think there's, those are things that I can do. And I hope that we can do as a nation state. As the UK, one of the opportunities we have is we can decide our migration policies. Whereas, one of the challenges at the moment is that the UN doesn't recognize climate refugees because how to define one is actually so tricky. So we're stuck in this place where there are different we's. We globally ought to recognize climate refugees, but we as a nation can also do that in a different way. So yeah, I think, and then there's we as the city of Exeter, there's we as a university community or a church community, we as a family, all these different we's. And I think that there's different levels of discernment that have to happen at all of them. There's not a global answer that this is how things should happen, but in each person's circumstance, situation, you kind of ask, what can I and my immediate we do, and then work with the layers. That's not a very helpful answer, I think, but yeah.
We see your hand and we're coming to it. But first, we're coming to a question online, which Morwenna will read, which is from Ellen.
Hi. So Ellen asks, I wanted to ask about the new monasticism and the ideas of challenging traditional images of success in terms of habitation. It seems to be that traditional ideas of moving out of the family home and living only with your partner and so on is rather heteronormative, and the kinds of change to these systems you were describing speaks to an already existing queer experience. So are there any queer readings or understandings of new monasticism?
I would say yes, but I don't know them. So I'm sure there are other people in the room who probably have better ability to answer that. It's the new monastic movement is one of the things that's on sort of the fringes of my ability to speak with any useful knowledge on. So I would actually say the thing to do is to get our friend Google to help with that one. But I think that there absolutely would be.
Chris, we'll come to you next. Please, Morwenna, could Chris have the mic? Thank you.
Uh-oh.
Always my ambition to ask Bethany a question usually proves impossible. But I really warm to the cultivation of new virtues, and I'm much persuaded by your list. I can't help thinking, particularly on this day of all days, that the other great virtue we need is some form of peace building. Not merely the ability, as you so eloquently say, to welcome the migrant and the stranger, but to coexist with the antithetical ideology. The world so desperately needs that, and few things are as unecological as war. So I just wanted to insinuate another virtue into your list.
Yes, absolutely. It's a list that could be usefully expanded in many ways, and I think that's a brilliant addition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Morwenna, can we take David's question from online?
Yes, so we have a question which is, do you think the biblical narrative can help nurture this perspective of radical hope beyond conflicting or apocalyptic interpretations? If so, which texts?
This is a great question. I love this. This I can dig into. So many. The answer is a resounding yes, because the Bible is full of stories of humans absolutely screwing up terribly and God taking their mess ups and making something new and beautiful out of it. I mean, the whole early cycle of Genesis is just sin and renewal, and then sin and then recreative renewal, and sin and recreative renewal. We just see it over and over and over again. We see it with Israel calling for a king and a king being put in place, and God using that in various ways into the narrative of salvation history when that was not part of God's plan according to the narrative. And we see that with the incarnation. We see that with the cross. Right? The cross is the greatest symbol of innocent, stupid suffering, which ends up becoming the point of redemption for the whole world. That out of death, God brings life. And so, there's often in the work that I've done on animal suffering and sort of how could God make a world where animals suffer so cruelly and so innocently, even before humans were around to mess anything up, right? All those massive changes of temperature resulted in mass extinctions. 99.9% of all species are now extinct already before we got here. So how is God good in that? And there's a sense in which there's a constant rebounding in nature where the innocent suffering becomes a point of new life, either for the creature that eats the creature who suffers, or when it dies, its life becomes the basis of other creatures flourishing. And I think that there's a similar pattern in history. I think that there's a similar way that God is constantly at work bringing good out of evil. So we could look at biblical narratives. We could look at the flood. We could look at the various narratives, but we could also look at nature as saying something of the same message.
I'm going to ask you a question because I'm standing in front of the microphone and I can. So given all that you've been saying, you've talked to us really powerfully about how when conditions become unsustainable for some types of life, they may become sustainable for different types of life, some of which we may not imagine. How attached should Christians be to the idea of a world which continues to be sustainable for humans? Because clearly we are not the only part of this story. How much of a loss will it be when actually the world is no longer sustainable for us, but is sustainable for other forms of life?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's the premise is part of the premise, I think, is perhaps not entirely correct, that this instance of climate change, I think, won't lead to a place where humans go extinct. We're just so adaptable and we have good technology. Some humans will survive, although I do think that there'll be a massive diminution in population. But ultimately, it's a question about sort of, does the project of God rely on humans? And I think it can't do. I just think that the work of God is much broader than that. I mean, if you think of it, human beings, if you took the whole history of life on Earth, that sort of 540 billion years or million years, and you turned it into a day, humans would arrive at sort of December. So the year starts January 1st. Sometime December 31st at sort of 11:40 p.m. is where anatomical humans arrive, and like Shakespeare would be like an eye blink ago, so we sort of naturally we sort of say, well, it must be about us, but I can't think of the project of God being only about humans. And that, as we're finding more and more exoplanets, as we're finding out that most stars have planets around it. You've got, hundreds of billions of stars in each galaxy and tens of billions of galaxies. I think that there must be life elsewhere. So again, okay, now I'm going totally off track. But if humans do go extinct, I don't see any reason why God couldn't raise up other creatures made in the image of God from cephalopods or from crows or from other things, because I think that what makes us in the image of God is Christ-likeness. And I think other creatures are also invited into that insofar as they do. So I'm working here from the work of Niels Henrik Gregersen, who's a professor in Copenhagen. He has this idea of deep incarnation, that when Jesus became human, he didn't only become human, he became mammal, he became chordate, he became animalia, he became living being, and also became molecules of oxygen, molecules of carbon. So all those things get wrapped up in the story of what the incarnation means, and that the incarnation can then have effects much wider than just the human family.
Thank you. We'll take Claire's question from online next. Are you happy to read that? Thank you, Morwenna.
So Claire Bryden says in her book, Hope in the Dark, Rebecca Solnit locates hope in the premise that we don't know what will happen, and that in the spaciousness of uncertainty is room to act. And now this is Claire, but most, all human beings don't like to be in a place of uncertainty or unknowing. How can we walk this narrow path?
Yeah, that's a great question. With help, with community, with the wisdom of each other. I mean, I think that it's the Claire is absolutely right that humans do not like uncertainty. And I think so much of our technological effort is based on increasing our certainty. And I think it's also interesting that sort of the picture of the Garden of Eden is a place not only of peace, but of plenty and of perfect predictability. And that those things are sort of lost in the fall. The idea that, each day we know what it will bring. And I think in many ways we've been driving back towards that sort of vision of the good life is the life that is certain, where we know what tomorrow brings. And I think that there's constantly a pushback in the wisdom literature in particular about saying we don't know what's coming, but that's where we walk after God and trust, and to have faith and bring out what wisdom and prudence we can in light of that uncertainty, but also live in and through it. So I often come back to that old serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Thank you. I know that we've 2 more people in the room who want to ask questions. If you haven't yet asked a question and you would like to, and you haven't yet formulated your question, but you're sort of grasping for it in your mind, can you just wave at me so I've got an idea of how many more people will be in the queue? Great. So we'll take these 3 questions in the room, and that will probably be all we have time for. Can I ask the questioners to keep your questions as brief and concise as possible so that we can hear from everybody? So Richard here to start with, please, Morwenna. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. My brain is reeling. You've left me extremely hopeful and extremely depressed at the same time. I want to know, are you an optimist, or do you, rather than being an optimist, do you have Christian hope or something, in the sense that what you've said about the self-regulating mechanism and so on, and things going extinct and replacing it. I'm thinking of all the French wine growers who are busily buying up tracts of southern England because Bordeaux is not going to grow any wine fairly soon, and that the climate's going to be better there. That is introducing new species that are not native, but and so on. But also when I look at, today of all days, the violence and so on, and I've just come back from spending some time with my little grandchildren, and I worry for the world that they're growing up into, and I wonder what I can do to make it better. And so much is really quite sort of minor things. But my question really is, do we have hope? And if so, how and what do we do?
Yeah. So I think you began by asking sort of, what am I? Am I an optimist or a pessimist, or, and I generally like to think of myself as a realist, wanting to really hit that middle road. That's not kind of saying, oh, everything will be rosy, but also not everything is as bad as it possibly can be. And there is that middle road, and it does leave you in exactly the place that I described. I said before the lecture to one of the other guests here that I hope he would leave both hopeful and sort of confused and disturbed. So if that's how you're feeling, that's great. because I think we need to get away from the really simple answers. If we all just buy our bamboo toothbrushes and drive a little less, we're fine. Not the case. But it's also not the case that everything will be absolutely the worst you can imagine. And so I think that there is hope for the future. But again, we're left in that place that was brought up by the other question of we can do things to sort of facilitate as much as we can, but we're not going to be able to control this entirely. Right. So there are things you can do to make the world better for your grandchildren. I think that includes welcoming migrants, living in community, creating a different type of social norm that creates that better world. But that's not a small thing. That's a heck of a lot bigger than buying your bamboo toothbrush and taking the bus once in a while. But I think that's the kind of radical change we need for the hope we want to have.
Thank you very much. We'll come to Sam at the back next.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I wanted to ask about migration. I think you've made a really good case that responding to climate change presents an opportunity for the virtue of hospitality to be cultivated in Western nations. But that also is built on massive cultural loss, upheaval, uprooting of those who live in what will be uninhabitable climates. And that their experience of being welcomed as strangers is immeasurably worse than being able to stay in their homes. And so I'm struggling to conceptualize that or to frame that as a narrative of redemption, because although there's maybe a redemption or a positive for those in the West, actually, on the macro level, there's not a good that's been brought out of ill in that case.
Yeah, sin has consequences. If we could make the world where they can stay where they are, that would be great. I think that world is lost. So that's just not a possibility, I don't think. And the fact is, the way the complexity of the narrative we're in is much worse than if we just stop doing all the bad things, people will do really well. The situation we're in is if we stop doing all the bad things, hundreds of millions of people die. Right, who can't cool their homes, who can't heat their homes, who won't get food. 40% of our emissions are put into agriculture to grow food for people. We stop doing those and people die. So we're, again, kind of, as was said at the beginning, near the front row, people die. And that's the reality we're in. There's no way out of that. So I guess I'm saying it would be absolutely better if we weren't in this position, but we are. So how can we walk forward with hope? How can we walk forward for a world that is the best that we can do with where we are? Yeah.
Thank you very much. We've got one more question to take. I'll just say now that if you haven't had a chance to ask your question or it occurs to you afterwards, Bethany will be here for a very few minutes at the end, but we are whisking her away to have dinner. So please come up and say hello to her at the end, but please don't keep her for too long. Thank you very much. We'll come to our last question.
Thank you very much. Well, actually, it's not really a question, but it's a bit of an advertisement. You kindly referred to Mother Teresa, the founder of the Franciscan Service of Jesus and Mary, on a number of occasions in your lecture. And I just want to say that Dr. Bridget Gillard, Secretary of the Devonshire Association, who is one of our trustees, has written the definitive book on Mother Teresa, which is called Mother of Invention, and it will appear with lots about her life and her thinking, which was so much reflected in your lecture. So thank you for that. And we'll put it on our website via Google.
Perfect. I'll be glad to read it. Thank you.
So it falls to me to thank you, Bethany, for your lecture and for your responses to our questions this evening. And I think all of us would want to say thank you so much for an extraordinarily rich and provocative time you've given us here this evening. I think one of the things I've always admired about your research is that you managed to blend together a huge amount of really technical expertise, which people like me who've always been in the humanities are just bewildered by, but with such a gift and skill at communicating that to those who don't have scientific training. And you've shown us that here this evening, but also a really rich theological sense of how we might build the foundations for hope. And yes, bringing in the people like the tradition of Mother Teresa and challenging us to think how we might follow people like her, people like Josephine Butler, and also all those other people who are quietly getting on, striving for the kind of places of hope that you've been talking to. So you've inspired us and you've laid us a challenge to follow. And so thank you so much. Thank you.
This lecture will be available on our website or recording on the website. Yeah, it'll be on the university website or
mentions capitals. Snowball.